At 5:30 a.m., as nearly all of the combat on the entire Fort Sill installation itself was coming to a swift, sudden end by this point, the Combat Engineer Battalion that had launched its last attack in its eastern sector of the installation, with 5 of its companies having freshly eliminated the 4th of the 60th SHORAD IM Battalion, as well as the Paladin M109A6 Artillery Howitzer Battalion of the 4th of the 3rd, belonging to the 1st Armored Division's Brigade Artillery Brigade. They now attacked from 2 sides from the northeast, with 5 attacking combat companies and 2 of the original 2 companies that seized the airfield, the southeastern airfield, attacking directly to the west, with 2 prongs to finish off the 4th of the 27th, 2nd of the 3rd, both being howitzer battalions, and of course the headquarters battery over the entire brigade itself, visiting originally for training purposes, along with the 15th Sustainment, which itself had 2 battalions in the area that were badly annihilated by crippling strategic air raids and precision strikes from Su-35 aircraft lingering over the battlefield in this sector. The 75th Field Artillery Brigade itself was all but destroyed, as it had been attacked by 7 battalions, 6 of which being combat engineer battalions of the 77th Combat Engineer Brigade, who attacked and started an entire line of contact in this area, with 1 mechanized infantry battalion coming from the 181st Combined Arms Brigade, which had originally entered the city and assisted with this additional battalion in seizing the vital I-44 highway, as this was vital, as control of major roads was a key objective insofar as allowing for logistics, troops, reinforcements, and such to travel freely up and down these vital roads. Clearing them adjacent of resistance was of key importance, as one of the 2 battalions had totally annihilated a group of roughly 200 reactionary armed civilians that had risen up in the southeastern part of the city and attempted to attack, although they didn't realize who they were attacking, as they had lost the entire grid, telecom, internet, phone, and anything that was satellite-based, as the anti-satellite strikes from the Dongning 2s and 3s and Russian S-500s and more annihilated America's military satellites first at midnight in 1 volley, with the following volleys destroying its myriad of commercial satellites next. The civilians were completely deaf, dumb, and blind, as was the military, although by the time the local electronic warfare assets on the H-6K-2 strategic bombers of their whole bomber squadron of 8 that were equipped with the KG-600 jamming pods left the area, radio had briefly returned, and the American cadre with their trainees, well over 1,000 of them, sent 200 to probe the forces holding the Henry Army Airfield, as they had a delusion that somehow, someway, they could recapture the airfield using their trainees, as it was a desperate move, as in a desperate situation like this, exactly these types of things would occur, no doubt. And they formulated an assault plan and used their best trainees that were farther along in their training to conduct more tactical maneuvers, while the least trained who had recently entered were utilized in human wave assaults, which, through sheer strength of numbers, despite the superior firepower of the special forces involved, having not only a vast array of their small arms, but also having a large quantity of light machine guns, general purpose machine guns, and heavy W85 12.7 millimeter machine guns put in different foxholes strategically placed throughout their defensive perimeter, also placing Type 72A anti-personnel mines, and their original plan was to mine the entire area on a continuous perimeter, but they ended up not being able to do so, as the attacks from the Americans had spoiled their efforts to complete their defensive perimeter planning, although they had enough defenses in place that they were able to not only repel these forces, but completely obliterate them, with very few escaping to tell the tale of what happened, proverbially speaking. This group of cadre that were armed with this M250 cal had fortunately been blessed that the human wave assault was the primary forces being dealt with on this hinge of the defenses, and it was so important to deal with them that This landing zone here, which had recently accommodated a fresh company belonging to the other battalion, had landed and even contributed one of its platoons just to block this area, along with well in excess of over a dozen CH-901A loitering munitions and FPV drone operators, such as they right here moving into place, launching FPV drones to help to repel the American attack, launching multiple of these in totality, numbering just in this area 14, as well as launching FPV drones by these other operators in this area over here as part of a spoiling attack with their mortars from their heavy weapons battalion or special weapons battalion firing from their recently seized Lawton Regional Airport, firing a heavy mortar barrage on this element of the attack on the very outermost edges of their mortar range, while also completely annihilating with mortars the hundreds of troops that were further to the south that were also part of the attack. The line held, and very few special operators were lost, and 2 armed robots were lost, numbering a total of 5 KIAs on the Chinese side of their operators, which was actually a fairly advantageous casualty count for them, as they were being attacked by massive numbers concentrated in one area at one time. But their drone, mortar, reconnaissance, and ISR superiority, and their tactical superiority and combat experience from the Syrian Civil War, many having rotated through units that were part of the action there that were sent on multiple deployments, totally repelled these forces. And now, at 5 a.m., as the fighting died out, 2 companies from these 2 battalions, each battalion numbering 8 companies, 2 battalions were spared from within this perimeter to leave the area and pursue on foot the now fleeing MPs who also tried to attack, with there being only 300 on foot left, as the ones in vehicles were annihilated as their vehicles were hit by all kinds of different munitions. Many of the Americans remaining are now foot dependent and had to use the proverbial boot leather express to get wherever they were going. But the special operators, not having any particular vehicles yet within this perimeter, as they conducted an air assault operation and were inserted and on foot, they, with some of their armed robots and some of their FPV operators with remaining FPV drones available to use, pursued in 2 companies on foot up the street and out of the airfield area, and went north in the installation and completely went adjacent to I-44, hit and cut off these retreating MPs and some of the cadre that went this way from over here with the MPs, completely cut them off as their drones relayed exactly where they were as ISR dominance, including the bigger, higher level drones like the WZ-7 are orbiting the battlefield, got a bead on their position. Helicopters from the 77th Aviation Brigade of the 77th Group Army from their combat aviation battalions, their 2 attack helicopter and armed reconnaissance battalions, were doing circuits, sending companies up to support the ground forces, including even the armored forces and mechanized infantry that also were operating in the area, cutting off retreat and destroying retreating remains of these training battalions belonging to the 434th, as in their skeleton crews left behind in the form of a few batteries, as most of their units were forward deployed to the Shepherd Air Base for base security operations as force protection, while the 428th remained, and most of them were destroyed, with mostly their headquarters units attempting to flee, along with the 2nd of the 6th, which was a schoolhouse unit of air defense forces retreating along with them. They were cut off by the armored and mechanized infantry forces trying to flee. They were cut off, surrounded, and destroyed by tanks, QN 506 anti-tank vehicles, which were actually multi-purpose and had anti-infantry armaments, which were extremely potent as well. And also mechanized armored infantry from the armored battalion, which were just mechanized infantry, and also the regular mechanized infantry battalion, using their IFVs and APCs and dismounted troops to help destroy these retreating forces. Some of them finally surrendered as they realized the situation was utterly hopeless. As that was going on, these special operators, by 5:30 a.m., had reached the northern portion of the post, as they had a very short distance to run, as they were on foot as well. And they surrounded with the aid of attack and armed reconnaissance helicopters, which the Z-11WAs were heavily armed for a light reconnaissance helicopter, firing their weapons along with the special operators on foot firing theirs and launching a few FPV drones and finishing off these forces before crossing the highway to cut off a small group of trainees and a few more cadre that weren't actually committed to the attack, these right here. They were surrounded and also destroyed by just the Special Operations Forces, as again, these forces were finishing off tiny pockets. These combat engineers and this one mechanized infantry, they were up here finishing off tiny pockets, cutting off retreats and all that, cleaning up the installation basically, cordons and searches where they would block off an area and sweep it, everything, the wooded areas, everything. They would cordon whole grid squares and sweep them and either net prisoners or destroy those who refused to surrender finally, now that the main fighting elements had been basically reduced to nothing as all their artillery and other vehicles had been destroyed. As the special operators finished off these trainees, who most of which finally surrendered as they couldn't take any more, and their leadership fell apart and discipline broke down as the special operators were too well trained and they had ISR dominance. They could see everything, where they were, what they were doing. So they attacked them when they least expected it as they were trying to flee and surrounding them. Even though they had fewer numbers, as this was only 200 special operations troops against over 700 trainees and some cadre remaining, they had surrounded them and wiped them out with their superior skills and experience and weaponry. By that point, the installation was being cleaned up thoroughly of enemy forces. Those, again, who wouldn't surrender were annihilated. And as this was going on, there was one final action in the battle that was occurring between 5:30 and 6 o'clock, with a little tiny bit of residual fighting going on until 7, with the last resistance being wiped out. But for the most part, early on in the battle, these 400 armed civilians had attacked these chemical defense troops, which were moving up into position. Now, the chemical defense unit was an interesting unit. It was like a bridge, in a way, between a combat unit and a support unit. Their main priority was, within their companies, they had certain companies that were frontline decon units, which were fully trained in infantry tactics and to fight in MOPP gear, where MOPP gear was essentially their chemical, nuclear, biological, and radiological protection equipment, which they wore, including their gas masks. They were trained to fight in that and fight well in that equipment, as all soldiers were trained in MOPP equipment, but not all of them could fight in those environments. And this chemical decon unit, the 77th Chemical Defense Bde, was specially trained to fight in chemical warfare conditions, as well as to decontaminate friendly units, as well as even certain installations or places that were contaminated via chemical weapons, as they were equipped with everything they needed for chemical attacks, including they were equipped with the Dongfeng EQ 1125, which was their chemical defense decontamination truck. It was essentially like a military fire truck, and it was a massive water container with a fire hose to spray vehicles down or personnel down, and they had a foam, like fire trucks have foam. They had a charcoal foam that could be put on personnel or equipment to decontaminate it and then rinse it off. Or if it was a nuclear radiological type of attack or environment, they could set up special decontamination tents and spray people down with water, as that was one of the main ways to decontaminate from radiological and nuclear type environments and attacks. But they could also, as this type of specialty unit, they could handle safely certain chemicals. And China, at this point, wanted to test out a lot of different new weapons that they had, including a type of chemical weapon that was commonly known as Fent, and they had endless precursor chemicals for it, and they produced it in huge quantities. And for a long time, it was used in the demoralization effort of America, where they were getting third parties to bring it into the country and sell it and have people overdose on it. But they realized it was a very potent chemical weapon, as even a small quantity of dust, like a less than a teaspoon could kill a small town, as in if it got into the water supply. So they decided to use a certain type of deployment method for this dangerous chemical weapon. They decided to equip a DJI Phantom 4 quadcopter drone with a chemical release container with slatted doors on it, and they would put a pound of this stuff in different containers, which could be released one at a time as they flew over an area, releasing the dangerous, deadly, toxic dust over a fairly large area. They decided, for safety purposes of friendly units, most of which by now were in the installation or in the city of Lawton, they decided to use a very small amount of this to test it out at first. So, they were trained in infantry tactics, being that they had, within their companies, they had 4 rear area decon companies within each battalion, and then they had 3 frontline decon companies that actually had NBCR or CRBN, if you will, vehicles that were protected from CBRN. They were IFVs and APCs with protection from those types of weapons, as in they had proper filtration for the air, and they had airtight seals on their vehicles, and they could operate in dangerous environments, including the Type 08 wheeled APC and IFV versions, which their frontline decon companies within their Chemical Defense Battalions operated those with their headquarters operating one of those Dongfeng EQ 1125s, while the rear decon units operated those as their primary because they were used to operating in more protected areas behind the lines of contact. But in this specific battle that occurred, they released a tiny amount of the toxic material via drone as some of the forces were trying to break out of encirclement. They were wearing their MOPP gear, their protective gear, and they decided to test it out. So against the last forces remaining that were attempting to break out early on in the battle, as in around between 140 and 240 was when this attack occurred, when all these civilians grouped up together. As their comms were gone, they had to relay messages by foot. They were disorganized, but they were trying to fight back in self-defense, as would occur naturally in a situation like this. So they moved into the area, and they tried to have people that could scout in different directions to find out what was going on. Their scouts were eliminated because they were seen before the scouts even seen them, because they were using their quadcopter squad-level reconnaissance ISR assets, as well as the hovering CH-4A drone, which had excellent night vision and IR sensors on it and cameras, and could see them as well from a high altitude, and was armed too. And it assisted in this specific battle by firing some of its air-to-ground missiles, including anti-tank missiles like the HJ-10, which was very powerful and could destroy groupings of troops as well. And it was armed with 6 hardpoints for 6 weapons, and it utilized them against these armed civilians to aid these chemical defense troops in their fight against them, slaughtering many of them with the tiny amount of the deadly chemical being utilized against the last remaining armed civilians attempting to break out of their encirclement. Up here, this grouping of just over 200 armed civilians, it was about 250 at the time, they encountered this headquarters battalion of the 77th Combat Engineers. And although these were a lot of administrative troops, the commander of the brigade was here, as well as other companies within this headquarters element. They all had their rifles and light machine guns, and they fought back. As it was a headquarters unit, it was a rear operating unit, not made for direct combat, but it could definitely fight off armed civilians, which it did. They fought them off. The drone sections within one of the companies of the HQ fired some of their deadly, nasty CH-901As at these armed civilians and slaughtered many of them. So they had to regroup, and they picked up some other armed civilians that were wandering around the area, as would occur in real life. And they regrouped together, and they decided to move to the south. But as they did so, they were now attacked by the Chemical Defense Battalions, these 3 right here, who had initially surrounded this group early on. Now, they were not necessarily sent direct into action, although they were here to clear the flanks. And as these forces regrouped with other new armed civilians that were moving around in the area, and they rebuilt their numbers, after having surrounded and destroyed this group, the 77th Chemical Defense Brigade sent only 3 of its battalions to attack this new regrouping of armed civilians, which was now back up to roughly 200 as more entered the area from all around. And they were now banding together, trying to see what was going on in the area and possibly make an attack against these enemy forces, as they were gung-ho. They wanted to fight. They were reactionary armed civilians. They weren't smart. They didn't want to go and hide immediately. They didn't want to get out of the hot zone and then get organized properly and figure out how they were going to fight a partisan operation against the invaders. No, they wanted to fight immediately. They didn't know who they were fighting. They had no actionable intel. They didn't know what they were up against or who they were up against. They didn't know what capabilities their enemy had. They didn't realize that their enemy was a very potent strike force of different types of units that had different capabilities that all worked in concert to destroy massive numbers of people. As by this point in the invasion, even just hours into it, millions of Americans have been killed in the crossfire or by direct fire, as they were in areas where battles were occurring, or they took up arms and attempted to fight as reactionary civilians, and whole areas were destroyed because of them, just to eliminate them. So millions of Americans were dead by this point, as the war raged all across the country. All the smart Americans ran to the wilderness, where they hid out and they started to try to get organized. They started to look for people that were intelligent and had actual aptitude when it came to survival and any kind of tactical knowledge, like ex-armed forces or anybody like that, or people who at least had training that could lead them and organize them. It was called being task organized, and they looked for people that could figure out a way to organize a proper force of partisans and get into a real tribe where everybody was delegated some type of position or job. But as that was going on throughout the nation, these reactionary armed Americans, they were gung-ho, but they got themselves annihilated every time. As they decided to take on these chemical defense troops that intercepted them because they seen them first, they already saw them getting organized and moving, so they clashed with them and created a small line of contact in a country area that was partially wooded, as well as had some homes and farms and ranches, and a battle began. And it was the last bit of fighting throughout this entire Lawton-Fort Sill battle, as these forces were finishing cleaning up, cordoning and searching the entire installation after having sapped it of all its combat abilities, destroying all of the major units and their equipment and slaughtering most of them. But now they were going around cordoning and searching to capture the rest or annihilate the rest who refused to surrender, which was being undertaken currently on the installation. As that was going on, this last fight with these armed civilians, as these other armed civilians had been slaughtered, and they had been slaughtered early on, they'd been slaughtered by support troops who were operating a supply bivouac area that were running convoys of supplies back and forth to the combat units, including the 181st and its subordinate units attacking the area. Even the battalion that remained on the highway protection and the other that went up there with the combat engineers, they were supplying all these forces, and even eventually the special operators, along with helicopter supply drops from the transport helicopters after they had finished dropping off the last two battalions of the 77th Special Operations Brigade as part of the mission, as part of the reinforcements. Even as all of this was going on, there were two mountain combined arms brigades that had already fought and helped in crushing the Shepherd Air Base in the Wichita Falls area, and they were being sent north as heavier reinforcements in the form of the 150th and 40th Mountain Combined Arms Brigades, and they were now coming up I-44. By the time they would arrive at 7 a.m., they would be late. Everything would be finally finished. As right now, between 5:30 and 6, this engagement was now occurring between the troops of the 77th Chemical Defense Bde, only 3 of its 8 battalions, not including its HQ, which its HQ had a drone section and fired some CH-901As. They clashed in, again, a semi-wooded rural farming ranching area, as this map depicts. Now here are the armed civilians running through these semi-wooded areas, and they're being seen, of course, by the ISR assets. This is a rear area decon company, okay? This is not one of the frontline decon companies of each battalion, but they, too, just like the frontline companies of each battalion were definitely combat trained, although these were more of a supporting element for strictly decon reasons. They could still fight and were still equipped with small arms. And fight they would, as their headquarters was responsible for operating the new chemical weapons drones to try them out now in full, now that they tested them a little bit at their last engagement against 400 armed American civilians toward the end of that fight, which at first they had mostly used their small arms and machine guns and grenades to wipe them out, but then at the last moment, as they tried to flee, these troops were already in their MOPP gear. They were already in their CBRN or NBCR gear, as if you will, their chemical and biological radiological defense. Well, they were stocked with all kinds of things like decon, like personal decon kits with charcoal powder, and also they had atropine injectors and many more things on their person, while their vehicles were fully equipped to decon whole areas, vehicles, and troops, such as their Dongfeng EQ-1125 chemical defense trucks, which were water and charcoal foam tank-based. They had tanks of these to spray on vehicles, troops, and areas they wished to decontaminate. This rear decon company itself had 4 of these Dongfeng EQ-1125, basically military chemical defense trucks. And they also had a lot of Shangji supply trucks for their chemical supplies. They also had tents for setting up portable decon areas. They had MRAPs in the form of VP-11 MRAPs with heavy machine guns on them, which surrounded these lighter forces of their different platoon vehicles, while the dismounts of these platoons here, these were several platoons. This was like 3 platoons worth of vehicles. And I'm sorry, 4 platoons worth of vehicles, because there were 4 Dongfeng EQ-1125s. And this was the headquarters platoon, a whole separate platoon, but it encapsulated the command, the captain, the company captain over this whole company, this rear decon company. And here you have a whole different company coming in the area. Remember, these troops were coming up to hit them head on before testing their chemical weapons, because they didn't plan on surrounding them, because they wanted to see what the full effects of what these drones could actually achieve. But in order to do so, their troops had to move into position and try to herd any escapees or attempting escapees back into the area of the spraying, the release zone. So what occurred as this heavier frontline decon company was moving in, you had dismounted troops from this rear echelon decon company of one of the 3 whole chemical defense battalions. Remember, they had 4 of these rear decon companies in each battalion, and they had 3 of these frontline ones with a headquarters company over the whole battalion. And there were 3 battalions. So this is just 2 companies from 1 battalion in just this portion of the map. This is only one map segment of everything going on. So over here, you have a road, a country road here. You have a country home. You have a barn here, a fence around this area for grazing. You have a house here. You have another road coming through here. This is another house with a garage, and you can see it from overhead. It's a large house. It has a garage here, has a back part and a main part. You can see that there's another farmhouse here and 2 barns, a silo for storing grain. And over here you have some country homes, ordinary homes. Well, what was going on was these armed civilians, again, were moving into the area just as they were moving into the area, and their troops were moving ahead of the vehicles, because remember, this is a rear echelon decon element, a unit, company. And they were not ordinarily a frontline unit, but they were being used as the chemical weapon forces to test out these chemical weapons, these nasty, toxic, horrifying chemical weapons. It was a new way of waging chemical warfare, especially using the DJI Phantom 4 quadcopters to do the job, although they fought with small arms as well. They had an OP right here. As their forces had earlier moved in and established OPs, or observation posts, they had a diamond formation here so they could watch all sides at the same time. These troops in one squad set up 2 half squads, or essentially like when they do stack teams and kick open doors in raid rooms, they're usually 5 if it's a squad of 10, or 4 if it's a squad of 8. Well, these two half squads faced this way and this way at their observation post, and you had these two doing the exact same thing. As these two were moving in to clear these farm buildings of any enemy forces, there were Americans hiding in the barn, and they knew it. So they bounded and covered tactically. They went first, laid down some fire on the barn. Then they moved again into this barn, breaking through the boards, getting in here, clearing it. And then as that was going on, they moved to the corner of the barn and established their stack team by pressing along the wall of the barn with the point man looking around the corner, laying some fire down. And then these guys ran in and broke through and basically cleared this whole barn full of Americans that were armed. They threw in some hand grenades and fired their light machine guns and small arms fire into the barn and wiped them all out. There were 15 hiding in this barn. And then after they eliminated them and cleared the barn, made sure it was clear, while this half squad stayed right here, this half squad went and kicked down the back door of this house and cleared the house and set up a position in the house while this group was still here by the barn. So this whole squad had taken control of this ranch as an observation post, with these two half squads looking on to provide them support from on this hill and just below the hill by the fence. While that was happening, this squad in a wedge formation bounded around. This was a gently rolling hill. This wasn't like a very steep hill, but it had wooded areas on it, on the elevation here. It's just a different elevation. They ran around this. They stopped by the fence corner. And then as they were doing this, and this group was coming in and stopping here, this diamond that had already set up an OP was about to move as these Americans were coming down relatively quick. And they started to light them up as they moved to the edge of this elevation here, and they started laying down fire in the prone position, and they fired a few fired 35 millimeter grenades from beneath their rifles. And there was a lot of small arms exchanges between these armed civilians who they moved here to the street before bounding across and stopping beside the house and they were laying down fire at this point as they were being fired upon. And then they moved here and were completely destroyed as they were trying to run. As this group was coming in here and stopping on the house and trying to run as well, they were trying to run and do like rush them basically, but they were both annihilated as they tried to do so by the intensity of the small arms fire, the grenades. The grenades played a big role in defeating these clusters of armed civilians as they really had no recourse against it. And as that was occurring, what happened over here was you had the groups running here trying to hide along and in the woods. You had another group hiding here by the woods and another running in here as these guys had already moved. These guys were staying here, but they were to be eliminated by the chemical weapons. This group here was running here, and this group was running here. You had a CH-901A destroy this pickup truck, which was essentially a technical, as there was a guy with a rifle in the back and a few guys outside and around it. This CH-901A came in. This one was armed with a fragmentation warhead and just blew this truck, and men shredded them to pieces because it was a light truck, and a fragmentation warhead was enough to destroy that and the passengers. Same happened here with this truck and this group. Fired from the headquarters battalion's drone sections over the entire 77th Chemical Defense Bde, of course. But they wanted to see what this chemical weapon could do. And as these forces were running here to the road, what happened here was these two bounded and covered tactically and seized control over this farm along with this squad coming over here. This was right here. This was one whole platoon, these 5 squads. What happened over here was this squad, and this squad, and this squad were a whole nother platoon. And this squad was part of a different platoon altogether. So what you had here was essentially 2 full platoons and an element of a third. And then you had some of the dismounted drone operators here. And what happened over here was as these forces were running, these guys, after they bounded and covered tactically to the fence, this guy crossed the fence, this group crossed the fence, laid down fire. By the time they reached here, because they knew the Americans were hiding on the other side of the barn, they seen them with their reconnaissance assets, and they also seen the ones around this house. So what happened was this squad got up here on the high ground. They deployed their small quadcopter drones, seen all of them. They bounded here and they began to fire back at this group here, who were firing back at them, hiding around the home and trying to get inside of it, but they were being lit up. And they were also being lit up by this group here as they bounded here and laid down fire and then bounded again because they were going to support the attack on this ranch. This group kind of hooked around and laid down some more fire and even fired at them, getting them to stop. Right as they were all in their chemical defense equipment, their MOPP suits, what occurred next was horrifying. As they fixed the Americans in position, including this squad here, doing a double fishhook maneuver around this line of armed civilians. By the time they got here, what happened in a double fishhook was you had the squad of 10 breaking into two groups. You had two continuing to shoot until the three went around, and then the three shot, and then they were going around by the time the three were shooting. That's how the fishhook worked. And they were doing it two different times as this group continued to try to move, and they were getting confused because they were being hooked around by two groups of 5 men who kept laying fire diagonally on them, and they couldn't respond adequately to it. Because even had they known tactical formations and they had been in a wedge formation, they would have tried to invert their wedge to counter that, as the wedge could fire in two different ways, but they didn't know to do that. They were just armed civilians, and they were confused, and they basically got annihilated in that double fishhook maneuver before this squad reformed and bounded around this way. Right as the chemical weapons of these drones here, this was a chemical-equipped Phantom, or DJI Phantom 4, flying in a circle around this group right here, releasing the toxic, nasty dust of the powdered Fent in a fairly large amount. Same happened here and here. They blanketed these whole areas in toxic, deadly. This whole group was gone. This whole group was gone. This whole group was gone. This group was gone. This group and this group and this group. They were all annihilated by the Fent, including this group by the house, which is why they're encircled in red and they didn't do anything. They were all annihilated. This is a very straightforward attack. By the time these forces of this rear chemical defense company of one of the 3 battalions present and the other forward chemical defense company moving in, they had already fixed the Americans by cutting off any escape that from ahead as they were trying to move into this area, and they cut off their ability to run to the sides because there were other companies of the battalion starting to cover the flanks of this entire area. As you can see right here, they were covering the flanks. This is just the middle area, and right here there was approximately, as this was the main part where there were others on the flanks, others of the chemical defense battalions, as there were 3 whole battalions in the area. There were others on the sides, on the flanks. This was a 1.5 mile by 1 mile map. And what occurred was they released their toxic powder as they flew over these groups, one at a time. These drone operators down here were operating those deadly drones to dump their loads little by little as the slats on the containers that held the deadly powder were opened bit by bit, releasing it upon these forces, putting them to sleep to never wake up again as they inhaled it. They all perished. They didn't have any way to defend themselves from it. They inhaled the dust and they perished. And what had occurred after this was, after the test had been concluded, which is a sick way to put it, but they were testing all kinds of different weapons in this conflict, including everything from new types of drones to new types of so-called space weapons, new types of aircraft, and new types of munitions. I mean, this was a test for all types of things. Like mentioned in the initial intro video to this entire documentary, they were testing everything possible that was either never used before in war en masse on a huge scale or never used at all. And this was a new way of deploying a chemical weapon called Fent. And it was so toxic, so easy to wipe somebody out. All they had to do was breathe in a little bit of the dust and they were a goner. They were done. If they didn't have any chemical defense equipment, they were out of there. They were finished. They all passed out to never wake up again. And the chemical defense forces went through the area, checked the bodies. They'd all turned, their lips had all turned blue, their faces had all turned pale, and their chests were no longer rising and breathing. They were all finished. And it was a sick attack, but as these forces on the ground fixed them into position. They were all wearing their CBRN defense gear, their MOPP suits, as they fixed them into position and wiped some of them out with small arms to keep them where they were long enough for this attack to go down. They had eliminated 200 or nearly 200 in this attack, and some of the dust blew over on the flanks and wiped them out. And what had occurred next, because it was such a toxin as far as that weapon was concerned, what they had done then was the 3 battalions, even followed up later by the rest of their brigade, went through the area spraying it down with water and, for good measure, charcoal foam. They sprayed the whole area with that. They didn't want any of the powder to blow towards their troops if there was a wind. So if they got it wet and even covered it in charcoal, that would have prevented it from being blown further away. So they saturated the area with their EQ 1125 military chemical defense trucks. And then, after the battle ended on the installation, the battle had been won. Many powerful elements of the American Armed Forces, insofar as artillery and air defense was concerned, were smashed at this installation, completely nullifying them from the ability of the Americans to even utilize them in any kind of combat. As, again, essentially all but a few installations were being overrun, and those that hadn't been overrun were smashed by missiles and airstrikes, and then they were checked later as a BDA, as a battle damage assessment, because they were literally hit that hard by missiles and airstrikes that they ceased to exist as a functioning installation. And many of those on the installation who were hit by all these strikes didn't survive to tell the tale. And those few that did were so shell-shocked that when the invasion units came to check the damaged areas, they just picked them up as prisoners without much of a resistance. As 98% of all the installations in the country were being overrun by ground troops with massive air support, massive missile support, massive artillery support, massive FPV and loitering munition support, massive helicopter support, the entire 9 yards, as the saying goes. And Fort Sill was no exception. Within a relatively short amount of time, not even a full 7 hours, because the attack itself, the battle itself for the installation began at 1:40 when their air support was arriving from their bases in Mexico. They had waited. They had opted to. The commander had the discretion to attack at any moment he wished, and he decided to attack when the electronic warfare assets on the H-6Ks had come in, along with their enormous, massive amounts of munitions, as a whole squadron of them could level a large city, essentially. If they all flew in a 8 aircraft formation and just steadily dropped munitions, they could level an entire medium-sized city, or a large city in some cases. And the Su-34 and Su-35 and even the J-11 fighters in the area provided excellent close air support. Even though the fighters were there for air superiority and combat air patrols, they served well in the ground support role as far as the troops on the ground, the close air support. They could fire or drop an array of munitions. And now that the American Air Force was nullified, as air bases were an extremely high priority for the invasion forces, now that the air was totally under Chinese and Russian and Allied control, as the Chinese and Russians had contributed the largest air contingents, as China had the most combat aircraft in the world and Russia the second, they had nullified the American Air Force mostly on the ground. The very few that were airborne at the time were shot down by the incredible air-to-air missiles possessed by China and also even Russia. But China had the longest range over-the-horizon air-to-air missiles in the world, called the PL-15. And they were coming out with newer, farther-ranged air-to-air missiles. But the PL-15 was unmatched by any air-to-air missile during the invasion. So the battle at Fort Sill and Lawton having had concluded, with the 77th PLA Group Army taking entire control over the entire area, was now in control of southwest Oklahoma and a large portion of northern Texas. The next battle, as there were many occurring within this invasion, especially in this entire south central invasion sector, with all the external forces coming in from Mexico and some that were beach landing, as well as all the enormous amounts of Trojan shock forces already inside the nation on CCP regime properties that popped up everywhere and captured their objectives, many within mere hours, such as what occurred at Shepherd and Wichita Falls, in addition to the battle at Fort Sill. The externals working with Trojans smashed Fort Bliss, which also was another base with a lot of firepower for the Americans. And at the border, many National Guard units were smashed by the external invasion prongs coming up from the McAllen area, as well as Laredo, as well as PAP, or People's Armed Police, fanatical CCP regime loyalist units, also smashed part of the National Guard forces on the flanks of their main attack of Group Armies 7 through 13, now deep into America, and already by hour 7 having had passed through San Antonio and on their way to Austin, 7 hours in. The invasion prong going up through the western part of Texas, not counting that going through New Mexico, the large prong of Group Armies 1 through 6 and the 41st Russian Combined Arms Army in one prong really had no opposition other than some farmers and ranchers trying to take pot shots at them, inviting a vicious response upon them as they advanced. And they were now deep inside of Texas, as they didn't have to fight battles on the border here, and they went straight in and were now passing the Midland, Odessa area on their advance north to the Texas Panhandle before they were to break up and the different group armies go either further north, go into Oklahoma, go into New Mexico, as that's what the purpose of the externals was to drive fast and deep into the country as quickly as possible and serve as reinforcements and sometimes even as replacements for the other Trojan forces that were deep inland already doing the fighting. As one of the group armies would come off the prong on the southeasternmost prong heading to the northeast into the southeastern United States, one group army would break off of it and relieve the active duty 83rd PLA Group Army for it to travel north through East Texas to now take over the AO in the Texarkana, Texas area and all of its surroundings. Much like the typed out story in the community tab of the Chad Carr channel, which features all of the fighting that occurred in the small town of Broken Bow and its local area, the 83rd Group Army being responsible for that whole AO of southwestern Arkansas, southeastern Oklahoma, and northeast Texas, and a small part of Louisiana. As all of this was going on, also at midnight of the invasion, a large chain of massive battles executed by the Trojan shock forces had begun within central Texas. From southern end of Texas by San Antonio, being carried out by the 2nd Russian Combined Arms Army with some Latin American allies, in conjunction with Chinese air support, with a Chinese PAP element, along with elements of the 2nd Combined Arms Army, capturing the entire Austin area, along with the Chinese 68th Group Army attacking Fort Hood with some other elements of the 2nd Combined Arms Army. Both would engage Fort Hood at the same time, which would be an enormous battle and would also figure into the battle at Waco, which was occurring very close by, just to the north of Fort Hood, as that, too, would actually be one of the longer-lasting battles of the 4-day invasion. It would last 2 whole days, as the Texas National Guard's 143rd Infantry Regiment, which was actually an airborne force, the only National Guard airborne force, was putting up a hell of a fight in downtown Waco, and they were using rubble and the underground to their best advantage as protection from the enormous rocket attacks and shelling. And they would put up a good fight for 2 days before they were finally smashed and eliminated. But that's a different battle further in the series. The next battle is the battle at Fort Hood itself. This was a massive, massive battle that involved elements of the Russian 2nd Combined Arms Army with elements of the 68th PLA Group Army, which itself was a reserve group army, the 68th. But it was still fairly well equipped as a reserve force, and it was about to have its baptism by fire along with the Russian Second Combined Arms Army, fighting the entire Three Corps, or the largest part of it, of the American forces in the South Central Invasion sector. Although the 75th Artillery Brigade was a part of the Three Corps, it was a small part of it, whereas much of Three Corps was at Fort Hood itself. And it would be smashed by the forces from the 2nd Russian Combined Arms Army and the Chinese PLA 68th Group Army, a reserve group army. They would be smashed by two different prongs coming in and attacking it from its south and from its southwest, as parts of this 2nd Combined Arms Army were going to hook around and hit it from the southwest, hit West Fort Hood, while the 68th Combined Arms Army would capture the city of Temple, a medium-sized city, the city of Belton, another fairly decent-sized city, all the cities along 190, which broke off of I-35 and headed to the main gate of the installation, would be captured by the 68th PLA Group Army, with the Russians doing their part as well. Fort Hood was a major, major battle in this invasion, and there are many subcomponents of it which come next. In this hypothetical 4th-generation warfare invasion documentary with real places, real equipment, real units, real everything, through the guise of 4th-generation warfare, this invasion was the biggest invasion in the history of warfare, 3 times bigger than Operation Barbarossa, and in just this south central sector, there were over 1,688,000 invasion troops between the Trojan components and the external components invading in just this sector alone. Next is the Battle of Fort Hood.